Upright, let us hear the Holy Gospel. Peace be unto all.
And to your spirit.
The readings from the Holy Gospel according to the Evangelist St. Luke.
Glory to thee, O Lord, glory to thee.
Let us attend. The Lord said this parable: a certain man made a great supper and bade many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. The first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee have me excused. And another said, I have brought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray thee have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So that servant came and showed his lord these things. Then the servant of the house being angry, the master of the house being angry, said to his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in hither the poor, and the maimed, and the halt, and the blind. And the servant said, Lord, it is done as thou hast commanded, and yet there is room. And the Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and the hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say unto you, that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. For many are called, but few are chosen.
Glory to thee, O Lord, glory to thee.
Please be seated. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory forever. In the passage just before where our gospel today starts, a man who's been sitting at Jesus' feet at the supper makes a great statement. He says, Blessed are those that will sit down to eat bread in the kingdom of heaven. And answering that, the Lord makes this parable available for our edification, as well as for those that sat there that very day. And the last verse of our gospel today says this: None of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. This is our focus for today. This is our warning, and it deserves our grave consideration. Truly deep consideration is necessary. It's a very serious statement that the Lord makes, given by himself to us. He says, none of those men and women and children who were bidden to the feast and who refused to come to the feast shall taste of his supper. None of those that were bidden and refused shall taste. This is a tragic statement. It's truly a deadly truth that none of those would taste of the supper. It was spoken directly to the Jews, to those present, and to us today. Past, present, future. It's been true, and it will be true, that none of those who are bidden and who refuse will come to the supper. When God bids us to come, there's no option to refuse, except at pain of eternal loss. All of those who were invited and who refused were excluded permanently, finally, completely. What a tragedy How short-sighted. How out of touch with reality. How ungrateful. How unappreciative. How self-centered. How bold. How very bold. How prideful. How utterly depraved it is to reject God's invitation. And so the Lord gives us this parable with this in mind and says to us, a certain man, God, made a great supper. The great supper is the heavenly, divine kingdom, the eternal, unseen kingdom that has God and his guests permanently in sweet fellowship and communion, everyone feeding on his very presence. He who is our bread, our heavenly bread, will feed us for eternity, sumptuously. Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you. And he said, I go to prepare mansions. He says, in my Father's kingdom, there's many mansions. Speaking of the greatness of this kingdom, not just as food, if you will, but housing, as clothing, as everything that man, woman, and child will need forever and ever. This is the great supper. And it says he bade many to come. He bade everyone to come, especially historically the Jews. They had the prophets. This is the first invitation. It was a general invitation to all to come to the supper. It was like mailing out your Christmas party invitations a month or two beforehand so that everyone could get it on their calendar. So it was that God invites all mankind through the prophets, through the forefathers whom we commemorate today. God called the Jews especially, but all the world, to come to his great supper. And then it was that God issued a particular invitation, a special invitation. He sent his servant, the Lord Jesus Christ, at supper time, when the banquet was truly ready, to bid them again to come. He said, please come. All things are now ready. I've given you a long time to prepare, but now is the last moment for you to move and come to the supper. This is a particular calling, a special calling, given by the Son himself. And he says all things are now ready, right now. This is the day of salvation. This is the day that we're bidden to come to this great supper. Sadly, I think in the spirit of that age, which mirrors the spirit of our age, they all, it says, with one consent began to make excuses. They all had the same mind. If you will, it was the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. They were all infected with the same lethargy, deafness, blindness to spiritual things. And they all, it says, with one consent, they agreed together. It was almost as if on a signal. They all responded in unanimity, having prepared beforehand their answer. They began, it says, to make excuse. And it should be clear that these excuses were not to postpone the dinner or to come late. It was not to come at all. They had no intention of coming to be with the Lord, with the Master, with God at his great supper. And then there's three listed. Three examples, if you will, for our admonition. All of these examples of the ones who gave excuse, or who couldn't come, or who wouldn't come, had one thing in common. Earthly things, things before their eyes, were more valuable than the things of God. They had their treasure. In their own eyes, they had what they needed, or they were going to get it. And God was not a part of their thought process at all. He was an interruption to their life, not a destination. And so it was that the first one says, I've bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. This is the earthly man, spiritually speaking. One whose natural sight is all that he has. All he sees is the natural world. He cannot see heavenly things, and so he needs to go see his ground. He needs to look upon those things and to revel in them. He's the lover of property, if you will. The things of the earth, possessions, things that he can touch, taste, handle, and see. And he gives this excuse that he needs to go look upon these things. Then the second one comes and says, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. He says the same thing, I pray thee have me excused also. Again, having no intention to come, no desire. But his reasoning is that he has 5 yoke of oxen, representing the 5 senses. And clearly here, his 5 senses, earthly, have overpowered his spiritual senses. And he is in total enslavement to the things of this flesh, this world. He's governed by them. He's the lover of earthly gain, if you will, striving for abundance in this life and this life alone. Spiritually dead, alive only to what he can see, what he can do with his own hands. And lastly, there's one that says this, I've married a wife. And it's interesting. He doesn't say, have me excused. He says, I cannot come. It's interesting how the last one is the most abrupt refusal. This is the one who cleaves, as a man who cleaved to his earthly wife, to the pleasures of the flesh, to the lusts of the flesh. He's cleaving to them. He's a lover of people and pleasure more than God. And even if he desired to come, he cannot come because he's so wrapped up in his passions and his sins. It's interesting about all 3 of these people that refuse, the categories, if you will. And we should look at ourselves and see which ones we fall into, perhaps many of them. It's interesting that all the things that they have as excuses are not intrinsically evil. They're not intrinsically things which separate us from God, but rather they should be things which point us to God in grateful thanksgiving, in praise, in wonder, in love.
Yes.
Instead, the earthly soul twists these things into things that are more important with God than God, and we push God out of our life by our adherence to these things, possessions, pleasures, the things of this world. Well, the Lord, it says, the master of the house, God himself, is angry at these that refused to come. Imagine this from God's point of view. Seeing reality as God sees it. Can we open our eyes and our minds and our hearts to see like he sees? He lays forth for us something which is so much greater than all these things which were excuses, that he must wonder. And in his sadness he must say, what more could I have done to draw them to the supper, to invite them, to have them love me? And so it's true that God, there's a sadness in his heart that breaks for us. As when the Lord Jesus wept at the death of Lazarus. He cares. He's sad. But it says here that he's angry. That God is angry. He's angry because our sin has this effect. It separates us from God and puts us at enmity with God. And it separates us from him. And so it appears as God is angered in his response to how things play out in our life when we reject him. God is angry. And so he says to his servant, the Lord Jesus, go quickly out of the streets, to the lanes of the city, everywhere you can find them. He says, and compel them to come in. These, he says, the poor, the maimed, the halt, and the blind. These are the ones, as opposed to the ones before. These are the ones who, in their own sight, are poor and need something else. They're not the ones that are self-contained with their property, their possessions, their wives, their pleasures. These are the ones who see themselves as poor, whether they have much in this world or not. And so God goes out and he compels them to come in the person of his own Son, showing himself to us in love, in sacrifice, in service, in many miracles, proving his divinity and his love at the same time. This is the one that invited the first three that refused. The same one now goes out and compels, and historically speaking, this is the move into the Gentile world, but it applies to all of us. God compels us through the work of his Son to come to us, to come to our senses, and to see the glory of the eternal kingdom.
Yes.
He winds up the passage with the verse that we started with. He says, my house is going to be filled. It's going to be filled, but will not be filled by those that refused me. There was a time when they could have accepted, and they didn't. And he says that none of those men that I went out to, none of those women, none of those young people that heard my word and that rejected it and would have none of me, later will be at this supper, the eternal kingdom. There's no equivocation with God. God's very clear on this. The kingdom of heaven is like, he says in Matthew 7. It's like a narrow way. And few there be that find it. Many go their own way. Many cannot come because of their passions and their sins and their relationships. Many will not come because of their desires. Their desire to yoke their oxen and go plow their fields and make money and be successful. Many of them are trapped in an earthly mindset by the zeitgeist of their age. And they just consent to go with the crowd. To go with the crowd to what? To emptiness that vanishes the second their eyes close in death. God offers us this eternal kingdom. This final word, if you will. None of those bidden will even be there, let alone taste of the glories of God's presence, his grace and his love, the warmth of his close communion for eternity. Are we struggling today to find that communion? Continue to struggle. Continue to pursue the Lord. It's a tragedy to think of missing the supper. If we're cogent, we understand that it's a tragedy to miss the supper and to get wrapped up with things of this earthly life. God's invited us to a supper today in church, the Holy Eucharist, to partake of his own body and blood, to be in sweet fellowship and communion with him now. But particularly, he's inviting you and I to his eternal supper. So much greater, everlasting. We have but a foretaste of it now. How do we take this invitation up and make good on it? When God bids us, what is our response? It's to do two things. As the Catechism says, it's to have faith that God is, and that he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. To believe that God is calling you, and that it's God's voice that you hear, and that it's God's supper to which you desire to be a participant. We need faith to start our journey, to make this invitation good. And secondly, we need to be clothed. We need to put on our best clothing to go to this feast, which is the righteousness of the saints. It's what's spoken about in our epistle in Colossians today. Put off the old man. We're going to a supper. Let's dress like it. If we believe that God is, let's clothe ourselves accordingly, as the Apostle Paul says in our little epistle today. Put off the old man. Put on the new man, who's clothed according to the righteousness of the Lord Jesus Christ. My brothers and sisters, God's calling us to the supper. May none of us be found turning our backs on him, either in this place or in the world to come. May we have our eyes set and our hearts fixed on loving God and fulfilling his purpose in our life. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.